Here is a truth almost no one wants to hear. The people who use you the most are rarely your enemies. They are the people you have trained through years of quiet compliance to expect nothing less than your obedience. You answer the message at midnight. You say yes when your body is screaming no. You absorb the blame in the meeting so someone else does not have to feel small. You call it loyalty. You call it kindness. You call it just being a good person. But somewhere beneath the surface, a quieter voice keeps asking the same question. Again and again at 3 a.m. when the house is silent. Why does giving so much of myself leave me feeling so empty? The Stoics had an answer for this. It is far harsher and far more freeing than anything you will find in a self-help book about setting boundaries. They did not see kindness as the problem. They saw the absence of discernment as the problem. The inability to tell the difference between a person worth serving and a person who will hollow you out and call it friendship. This is not a lesson about becoming cold. It is not about walling yourself off from the world. Notice what actually happens in your body the next time you agree to something you do not want to do. There is usually a small, fast contraction. A flinch you have learned to override so quickly, you barely register it anymore. That flinch is data. It is the part of you that still knows the difference between choosing and complying, even after years of training yourself not to listen to it. Most people treat that flinch as a flaw. The Stoics treated it as a signal. This story is about a Roman statesman who spent the better part of his life serving a man who would, in the end, order his death. He left behind in his own letters the exact philosophical machinery for recognizing when you are being used long before the final blade falls. His name was Seneca. His story is not a tragedy about weakness. It is a masterclass in the psychology of self-erasure and the long, difficult road back from it. In the year 49 AD, Lucius Annaeus Seneca was recalled from 8 years of exile on the island of Corsica. He had been sent away by the Emperor Claudius on a charge of adultery with a member of the imperial family. It was a charge historians still regard as almost certainly political rather than true. He returned to Rome not as a free man reclaiming his life, but as a tool for someone else's ambition. The Empress Agrippina, Claudius's new wife, needed a tutor for her son. A boy of 11 who would one day rule the known world. His name was Nero. Agrippina chose Seneca for the position specifically because he was brilliant, respected, and crucially, indebted to her for his return from exile. He owed her his freedom. And debts, as the Stoics understood long before modern psychology gave it a name, are one of the oldest tools of quiet control. For the first years, the arrangement seemed to work. Seneca taught the boy rhetoric, philosophy, and the art of governing with restraint. In his surviving essay De Clementia on Mercy, written directly to the young emperor early in his reign, Seneca laid out an entire vision of gentle, moderate rule. It was a mirror he was holding up, hoping the boy would grow into the reflection. For a time it seemed to be working. The early years of Nero's reign, guided heavily by Seneca and the Praetorian prefect Burrus, were later remembered by Roman historians as a period of relative stability, sometimes called Nero's 5 good years. Picture the daily texture of that arrangement, as best the surviving record allows us to reconstruct it. Seneca rising before dawn in his study, drafting speeches the young emperor would deliver to the Senate as though they were his own words. Seneca present at councils, softening decrees, tempering the impulses of a boy who had inherited absolute power before he had inherited any real restraint. Every gesture of moderation the empire witnessed in those years likely passed through Seneca's hand first. This was not passive tutoring. It was daily, exhausting, invisible labor. The work of holding another person's worst impulses at bay, hour after hour, year after year, while the credit for the empire's stability accrued to the throne, and not to the man managing it from the shadows. But the tension underneath never fully resolved. Seneca had built his entire public identity and a considerable personal fortune on his proximity to power. The historian Tacitus records that Seneca's enormous wealth became a source of public resentment and private unease. He had become, in the eyes of many, exactly the kind of man his own philosophy warned against. Entangled, compromised, useful to a regime whose cruelty was becoming harder to ignore. Nero's character darkened. His mother Agrippina, once his greatest champion, was murdered on his orders in 59 AD. It was a matricide so shocking that even hardened Roman senators recoiled. Tacitus records that Seneca was asked to help draft the official letter to the Senate justifying the killing. He did it. Whatever he felt in that moment, whatever internal war raged behind his composed philosopher's face, he picked up the pen. This is the part of the story that rarely makes it into inspirational quote graphics. The wise man did not walk away. Not yet. By 62 AD, Seneca could see clearly what he had allowed himself to become. Indispensable to a man he no longer respected. Wealthy beyond reason. Quietly complicit in decisions his own writings would have condemned. He went to Nero and made a request that historians still find remarkable. He offered to give back his fortune, his estates, his gardens, everything the emperor had granted him, in exchange for permission to retire from public life. Nero refused the gift and the request both, with words of flattering reassurance that fooled no one paying close attention. He needed Seneca visible. A trusted philosopher standing beside the throne was worth more to Nero's image than any sum of gold. Seneca, despite formally withdrawing from most public duties shortly afterward, could not fully extract himself. The relationship, the use, continued at a diminished volume, right up until it ended altogether. In 65 AD, a conspiracy against Nero's life was uncovered, the Pisonian conspiracy. Whether Seneca had genuine knowledge of the plot remains disputed among historians to this day. What is not disputed is the outcome. Nero sent an officer to Seneca's villa with the order to take his own life. Tacitus describes the scene that followed in careful, almost unbearable detail. Seneca, calm and apparently unsurprised, comforted his weeping friends and his wife, Paulina. He reminded them, in a final act that was his own philosophy made flesh, that they had long known the character of the man they served, and that nothing about this ending should shock them now. He opened his veins. The process was slow. His aged body resisted death longer than he expected. He continued dictating his final thoughts to secretaries even as the blood loss overtook him. He was ultimately carried to a warm bath to hasten the end, finally succumbing to the fumes of a steam room. He died as he had spent his final years urging his student to live, with acceptance, without begging, without the frantic scramble to be needed one more day. Consider what did not happen in that room. There was no letter sent begging for reconsideration. No last attempt to remind Nero of the decades of service. The speeches drafted, the empire steadied through the sheer force of one man's patient restraint. Seneca had already made peace with the fact that none of it had ever guaranteed him safety in the first place. The debt he had once owed Agrippina for his return from exile, the years of managing a volatile young ruler, the fortune he had tried and failed to hand back, none of it had purchased what he might once have hoped it would. What it had purchased in the end was time. And in that final night, with his friends weeping around him and his own blood slowing beneath a physician's lamp, time was the only currency that had ever mattered at all. That was the true cost. Here is what almost every retelling of this story gets wrong. The tragedy of Seneca is not that Nero was cruel. Cruel men have always existed and they always will. The real tragedy, the one worth sitting with, is that Seneca could see it happening. He named it clearly in his own letters. Yet it still took him years and enormous cost to act on what he already knew. That gap between clear-eyed awareness and actual boundary is where almost all of us live. Modern psychology has a term for what happened to Seneca inside that relationship, long before Nero ever sent for the executioner's order. It is called an unequal exchange relationship, a bond where one party consistently gives status, resources, protection, or emotional labor, and receives in return a kind of provisional tolerance that can be revoked at any moment. The person on the giving end often mistakes their own indispensability for security. They think, if I am useful enough, valuable enough, agreeable enough, I will be safe. But usefulness was never the same thing as being valued. Seneca was extraordinarily useful to Nero for over a decade. He was never, in any way that mattered, safe. This is the exact mechanism behind chronic people-pleasing today. It rarely looks dramatic. It looks like the employee who takes on every extra task because refusing feels like risking their entire identity at that company. It looks like the friend who is always available, always accommodating, and who has quietly noticed, but never said aloud, that the accommodation only ever flows one direction. Seneca himself diagnosed this dynamic with startling precision, centuries before the field of psychology existed. In his letters to Lucilius, he repeatedly urges his friend to be deliberate about who receives access to his time and trust. He warns against the exhausting habit of trying to be agreeable to everyone, a way of living that leaves a person belonging to no one, least of all to himself. The Stoics did not see indiscriminate agreeableness as a virtue. They saw it as a failure of judgment. The same failure of judgment as investing all your capital in a single asset and calling it loyalty. There is a deeper psychological wound underneath this pattern, and it deserves to be named honestly. Many people who give too much do so because somewhere earlier in life, love or safety felt conditional on their usefulness. Being needed became a stand-in for being wanted. And so the nervous system learns a simple, exhausting equation. My value equals my output. Stoicism, properly understood, is not cold indifference to this wound. It is the opposite. It insists that your worth was never up for negotiation in the first place. It does not fluctuate based on how much you are willing to sacrifice for someone else's convenience. This is precisely why Seneca's final act carries such weight. In the moment his usefulness to Nero was formally revoked, he did not collapse in shock. He had already internally stopped needing Nero's approval to know who he was. The tragedy is how long it took him to arrive there. And the lesson for us is that we do not have to take nearly as long. There is one more layer worth naming, because it is the layer most people skip past on their way to the empowering part of the lesson. Boundaries are not a technique you apply once and then enjoy forever. Seneca did not simply learn his lesson and live free of entanglement from that point forward. The record shows a man who understood the problem with startling clarity years before he found the courage to act on it even partially. And in the end, he still could not fully extract himself from the very relationship he had diagnosed as costing him too much. This is not a flaw in the philosophy. It is an honest account of how difficult disentangling from a person who benefits from your compliance actually is, even for a man who had written more clearly about self-possession than almost anyone in the ancient world. Insight does not automatically produce freedom. It only makes freedom possible. Acting on it is a separate, ongoing discipline, practiced daily, often imperfectly for the rest of a person's life. Stoicism was never meant to stay in the pages of ancient letters. It was built from the beginning as a practical discipline, a set of daily exercises for living with clarity. Here is how to apply what Seneca eventually learned, without waiting for your own version of the executioner's letter. Step 1. Run the Seneca audit. Seneca advised Lucilius in his letters to examine his relationships with real scrutiny. Not out of suspicion, but out of respect for his own limited time. Take 15 minutes this week and make an honest, private list of the 5 to 7 people who ask the most of your time, energy, or emotional bandwidth. For each one, ask a single blunt question. When was the last time this exchange moved in both directions? Not the last time they said something kind. The last time they gave something back proportional to what they take. This is not an invitation to cut people off impulsively. It is an invitation to see the actual shape of your relationships, instead of the story you have been telling yourself about them. Here is what this looks like in practice. Say one name on your list is a coworker who routinely offloads their unfinished tasks onto you at the end of the day, always with a plausible excuse and always with visible gratitude in the moment. The gratitude feels like proof the relationship is healthy. But gratitude is cheap. It costs the giver nothing. What costs something is reciprocity. Did they ever cover for you during a crunch? Did they defend you in a meeting you were not in? Did they notice when you were overwhelmed without being told? If the honest answer is no, you have not found a villain. You have found a pattern. And patterns, unlike people, can be changed without confrontation, simply by responding differently the next time the pattern repeats itself. Awareness, for the Stoics, always came before action. You cannot correct an imbalance you have refused to measure. Step 2. Install the reserve clause. Epictetus, in the Discourses and the Enchiridion, built his entire philosophy around one core distinction. Some things are within our control and some things are not. Other people's opinions of you, their disappointment when you say no, their comfort at your expense, these were never within your control to manage, no matter how hard you try. What is within your control is your own answer. Practice this concretely. The next time a request lands on you that you feel the automatic urge to accept, do not answer immediately. Say out loud or internally, "Let me check and get back to you," and give yourself even just 1 hour of distance before responding. In that hour, ask whether you are saying yes from abundance or from fear. This single pause, repeated consistently, begins to rewire a nervous system trained toward instant compliance. The reason this works is worth understanding, not just following blindly. Instant agreement is often a stress response disguised as generosity, a way of ending the discomfort of someone else's expectant silence as quickly as possible. The pause interrupts that reflex loop before it completes. It does not require you to become someone who says no more often. It only requires you to become someone who answers on purpose. Some requests will still earn a yes after the hour has passed, and that yes, chosen deliberately, will feel entirely different in your body than the yes you used to give on autopilot. Over weeks, this practice does something Epictetus described as central to freedom itself. It returns the decision to the one place it was always supposed to live, inside your own judgment, rather than in the immediate emotional pressure of another person's request. That is true control. Step 3. Give from surplus, not from self. In his essay De Beneficiis, on benefits, Seneca argued at length that the wisdom of giving lies not in the size of the gift, but in the discernment behind it. Giving without judgment to anyone who asks, regardless of their character or intentions, actually cheapens generosity rather than expressing it. Apply this directly. Before agreeing to help someone, ask what it will cost you. Not just in time, but in sleep, in peace, in the energy you needed for your own responsibilities. If the honest answer is that you would be giving from your last reserves rather than your surplus, that is information, not selfishness. A candle cannot light a room after it has burned itself out. Protecting your own flame is not the opposite of generosity. It is the precondition for any generosity that lasts. Picture two versions of the same act. A friend asking to stay at your apartment for a week during a rough patch. In the first version, you say yes while quietly resenting the disruption to your sleep, your space, your work deadlines, saying nothing about the cost because voicing it feels selfish. In the second version, you say yes and are honest, even briefly, about what you need in return. Quiet mornings, some space in the evenings, a clear end date. The act looks identical from the outside. The internal experience and the resentment that either does or does not accumulate afterward is entirely different. Seneca's point was never that boundaries shrink a gift. It was that a gift given without accounting for its true cost eventually curdles into quiet bitterness, and bitterness corrodes a relationship far more thoroughly than a clearly stated limit ever could. Step 4. Practice the view from above. Marcus Aurelius, in Meditations, repeatedly returns to a mental exercise now sometimes called the view from above. Imagining your life, your worries, and the people around you from a vast cosmic distance, to strip away the exaggerated weight the present moment gives to any single relationship or conflict. When you feel paralyzed by fear of disappointing someone, mentally zoom out. Picture the situation 5 years from now, then 50, then from the height Marcus imagined, looking down at the whole turning earth. Most of what currently feels unbearable to refuse will feel, from that distance, almost weightless. This is not a trick to make you stop caring. It is a tool to help you care about the right things, in the right proportion, instead of letting the loudest demand in the room dictate the shape of your entire life. Marcus wrote this exercise into his private notebook while commanding armies on the northern frontier, managing plagues, and burying his own children. A man whose obligations were, by any measure, heavier than almost anyone's today, and who still found it necessary to remind himself, in his own hand, not to let any single demand consume the whole of his attention. If an emperor needed this practice to keep his sense of proportion intact, an unread message from a coworker is unlikely to be the exception that justifies losing yours. Return to this exercise anytime one obligation starts to feel like the entire weight of your world. It rarely is. It only feels that way up close. Seneca spent years serving a man who would, in the end, order him to die by his own hand. And yet, when that order finally arrived, he did not fall apart. He met it the way he had spent decades urging others to meet every hardship. Without begging, without collapsing, and this matters most, without a single flicker of surprise. He had already done the work. He had already stopped mistaking his usefulness for his worth. You do not need to wait for a crisis to do the same. You do not need permission to stop overextending yourself for people who have never once asked what it cost you. Being kind was never the problem. Being indiscriminate was. The Stoics do not ask you to grow cold. They ask you to grow discerning. To reserve your deepest loyalty, your longest hours, your most exhausted yes, for the people and the work that actually deserve them. Somewhere tonight, someone is drafting a message they already know will drain you. You get to decide this time whether the old automatic yes answers for you, or whether the version of you that has been paying attention finally speaks instead. This will not feel dramatic. There will be no marble villa, no historic reckoning, No audience watching to see if you finally choose yourself. It will look small. A slightly delayed reply, a question asked before an answer given, a flinch you finally let yourself notice instead of overriding. But small, repeated choices are exactly how a person like Seneca became a person capable of facing the end of everything without flinching at all. The discipline was never built in the final hour. It was built in 1,000 ordinary ones that came before it. Reserve your fire for what deserves it. If this brought you any clarity tonight, subscribe. Every week we take another lesson from the Stoics. Not as ancient history, but as a working manual for the exact pressures you are carrying right now. There is more of this waiting for you. Until then, stay disciplined, stay discerning, and stop giving your fire to rooms that were never going to keep it lit.